It was the kind of morning that carried silence like a weight, thick, cold, and unyielding. The grand office overlooking Chicago's skyline was empty, but for one man, sitting motionless in an expensive leather chair, staring at a phone that never seemed to ring. His world was one of halted time, where clocks were frozen and the city's distant hum felt like a muted echo from another life. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're looking at an old photograph or remembering something you lost long ago. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise today's story will touch your soul. The 43rd floor of the Hartman Financial Tower stretched endlessly before Daniel, its floor-to-ceiling windows revealing a Chicago morning painted in shades of gray and amber. The Lake Michigan horizon blurred into clouds heavy with unshed rain, while below the morning rush hour moved like ants through concrete arteries. Daniel Hartman sat behind his mahogany desk, a piece so large it could have hosted a dinner party for 12, yet he occupied only a small corner of it, hunched over documents that blurred before his tired eyes. At 52, Daniel possessed everything the American dream promised: a net worth approaching $2 billion, a portfolio diversified across tech companies, real estate investments spanning from Manhattan to Silicon Valley, and even a substantial holding in cryptocurrency that had multiplied his wealth beyond imagination. His empire included 3 major subsidiaries, each generating millions in quarterly revenue, employing thousands across the Midwest. Stock analysts called him a visionary, business magazines featured him on their covers, and financial networks quoted his market predictions like scripture. But wealth, as Daniel had learned in the cruelest possible way, could not fill the cavern that had opened in his chest 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago. Not since the morning Sarah had kissed his forehead goodbye, whispered she was running to the grocery store, and simply vanished. The police investigation had yielded nothing. Her car was found abandoned near Navy Pier. Her purse intact, no signs of struggle. Just an absence so complete it seemed to mock the very notion of closure. The silence in his Lincoln Park mansion had become suffocating. 23 rooms, each one a monument to their shared dreams, now stood empty except for the ghosts of conversations that would never resume. The grand piano Sarah had played on Sunday mornings remained closed, a thin layer of dust coating its ebony surface. Her reading chair by the fireplace still held the impression of her body, and sometimes, in the loneliest hours before dawn, Daniel would sit there and breathe deeply, searching for any trace of her lavender perfume. His assistant's morning briefing had become a ritual of mechanical precision. Stock prices, board meeting agendas, investment opportunities, all delivered in clinical tones that matched the sterile atmosphere of his corner office. But this Tuesday felt different. The rain drummed against the windows with unusual persistence, and the city seemed wrapped in a melancholy that matched his own. Daniel's phone had been silent for hours, which wasn't unusual. Most of his communications flowed through emails and scheduled conferences. Personal calls were rare. Friends had gradually stopped reaching out after months of unanswered invitations and declined social engagements. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of profit margins and quarterly reports, a universe measured in dollars and cents rather than heartbeats and laughter. The weight of his isolation pressed down like a physical thing. He could buy anything, travel anywhere, command the attention of senators and CEOs, yet he couldn't purchase a single genuine conversation or a moment of authentic human connection. His wealth had become both shield and prison, protecting him from the world while simultaneously cutting him off from it. Outside, Chicago pulsed with life. Commuters hurrying through the rain, children splashing through puddles on their way to school, lovers sharing umbrellas, vendors calling out their morning specials. But Daniel experienced it all through glass, a spectator to the human drama unfolding below, forever separated by the altitude of his success and the depth of his grief. The morning stretched ahead like all the others, promising nothing but the familiar ache of existing without truly living, of breathing without feeling alive, of possessing everything while having nothing that truly mattered. 7 blocks south of the gleaming Hartman Financial Tower, In a narrow apartment above Rosario's diner on Halsted Street, a different kind of morning was unfolding. The aroma of fresh coffee and frying bacon drifted up through thin floorboards, mixing with the sound of Maria Santos humming softly as she braided her daughter's chestnut hair. Mia Santos sat cross-legged on their second-hand couch, her school backpack already packed and waiting by the door. At 7 years old, she possessed the kind of natural curiosity that turned every ordinary moment into an adventure. Her wide brown eyes, inherited from her grandmother's Mexican heritage, seemed to catch and hold light in a way that made everything around her appear more vivid, more alive. "Mommy, Mrs. Henderson upstairs is crying again," Mia observed, tilting her head toward the ceiling. The thin walls of their building held few secrets, and Mia had developed an uncanny ability to sense the emotional temperature of their small community. Maria paused in her braiding, listening to the muffled sounds from the apartment above. Mrs. Henderson was 83, a widow whose children rarely visited, surviving on Social Security and the occasional kindness of neighbors. "Maybe we should bring her some of those cookies we baked yesterday," Maria suggested, though she knew their own resources were stretched thin. This was their reality, a life measured not in stock portfolios or real estate holdings, but in small acts of kindness and the careful budgeting of grocery money. Maria worked double shifts at the diner below, serving coffee and conversations to an endless stream of construction workers, office clerks, and late-night wanderers. Her tips, carefully counted each evening, determined whether they could afford the good cereal or the generic brand, whether Mia could have new school supplies, or would make do with last year's worn notebooks. But their small apartment radiated warmth that no mansion could match. Hand-painted ceramic bowls from Maria's mother lined the kitchen shelves, colorful blankets covered the second-hand furniture, and Mia's artwork. Crayon drawings of rainbows and families and angels with crooked wings decorated every available wall space. "Tell me again about the angels, Mommy," Mia requested as she did most mornings. It was their ritual, this storytelling that bridged the gap between sleep and the demands of the day. Maria's fingers worked gently through her daughter's hair as she spoke. "Well, mija, your abuela used to say that angels don't always look like the pictures in church books. Sometimes they look like regular people, like the mailman who remembers your name, or the bus driver who waits for you when you're running late, or the little girl who shares her cookies with someone who's hungry." Mia nodded solemnly, as if receiving instructions for a sacred mission. She had inherited not only her mother's warm heart, but also an inexplicable wisdom that sometimes startled adults. Teachers at her elementary school often commented on her unusual empathy, the way she seemed to understand when classmates were sad or frightened, offering comfort with an instinct that felt almost supernatural. The morning routine continued with practiced efficiency. Maria packed Mia's lunch, a peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a small thermos of chocolate milk, while Mia gathered her books and checked that her special drawing was safely tucked in her backpack. It was a picture of two people holding hands under a bright sun, their faces smiling despite the purple storm clouds in the background. "Who are those people, mija?" Maria had asked when Mia first showed her the drawing. "I don't know yet," Mia had replied with the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood. "But I think they need to find each other." As they prepared to leave, Mia paused at their small window, pressing her nose against the glass to watch the rain create rivers along the sidewalk. The city looked different from their third-floor perspective, more human, more connected. She could see the grocery store owner sweeping his front steps, the elderly man who fed pigeons every morning despite the rain, the young mother pushing a stroller while talking animatedly on her phone. Each person carried their own story, their own joys and sorrows, and somehow Mia seemed to sense them all. "Mommy, do you think sad people know they're not alone?" she asked, her breath fogging the window. Maria paused, struck by the depth of her daughter's question. "Why do you ask, baby?" Mia shrugged, still watching the street below. "Sometimes I can feel when people are lonely, even when they're surrounded by lots of things, like they forgot how to see the goodness." These moments always caught Maria off guard, these flashes of insight that seemed to come from somewhere beyond a 7-year-old's experience. She attributed it to Mia's tender heart, her natural empathy amplified by their close-knit community where everyone knew everyone's struggles and celebrations. The rain was falling harder now, turning the morning commute into a careful dance of umbrellas and hurried footsteps. Somewhere in the distance, the clock tower of Holy Name Cathedral chimed 8 times, its bronze voice carrying across the neighborhoods like a benediction. In a few minutes, they would venture out into that rain-soaked world, Maria to her shift at the diner and Mia to her classroom full of friends and discoveries. Neither of them could imagine that, before this gray Tuesday ended, their small warm world would intersect with another, one measured in millions and marked by loss, where silence reigned and clocks had forgotten how to tick. The invisible threads that connect all human hearts were already weaving their story, guided by the mysterious forces that sometimes use the smallest hands to perform the greatest miracles. The call came at exactly 10:47 a.m. Central Time, according to the digital display on Daniel's desk phone, a detail he would remember with crystalline clarity for the rest of his life. He had been reviewing quarterly projections for his technology investments when the sharp ring cut through the morning silence like a blade. Daniel stared at the device, momentarily paralyzed by its unexpected intrusion. Personal calls to his direct line were extraordinarily rare. Business matters were typically filtered through his assistant, and social calls had essentially ceased to exist in his carefully controlled world. The phone rang a second time, then a third. Daniel reached for it with the mechanical precision of a man who had trained himself to show no emotion during even the most consequential business negotiations. His hand hovered over the receiver for a moment, some instinct warning him that this call would somehow matter in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. But before he could lift the receiver, before he could speak his customary greeting of "Hartman," a voice filled the line. It was small, clear, and utterly unexpected. The voice of a child. "Hello?" the voice said, with the careful pronunciation of someone still learning to navigate the complexities of telephone etiquette. "If you want to change the world, start by fixing your heart." Daniel's hand froze inches from the phone. The words hung in the air between them, delivered with such simple conviction that they seemed to bypass his rational mind and strike directly at something deeper, something he had spent 3 years trying to bury beneath layers of work and willful numbness. Daniel began, his voice cracking slightly. When had he last been surprised by anything? When had anyone last said something to him that wasn't carefully rehearsed, professionally polite, or designed to extract something from his vast resources? The child, it was clearly a little girl, seemed to sense his confusion. "You're not alone," she whispered, with the kind of certainty usually reserved for mathematical equations or stock market closings, but somehow infinitely more convincing than either. Daniel managed to find his voice, though it emerged as little more than a bewildered whisper. Who is this? How did you get this number?" There was a rustling sound on the other end, as if papers were being shuffled, followed by a man's voice in the background. Probably building security, or a maintenance worker. "Mia, honey, you can't just pick up phones that don't belong to you. Come on now, your mom will be worried." "I have to go," the little girl said, but her voice carried a note of reluctance, as if she had more to say. "But I meant what I said about your heart. Sometimes the best things are scared to grow when everything around them is too cold." The line went dead, leaving Daniel alone with the dial tone and a sensation he couldn't name. His hand remained suspended over the phone, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. In his world of calculated risks and measured words, this brief interaction felt like a meteor striking the perfectly ordered surface of his existence. He tried to return to his quarterly reports, but the numbers seemed to swim before his eyes. "If you want to change the world, start by fixing your heart." The phrase echoed in his mind with irritating persistence. What could a child possibly know about his heart, about the careful barriers he had constructed to protect what remained of it? And yet those 8 words had somehow found their target with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. Daniel pushed back from his desk and walked to the window, his reflection ghost-like against the gray Chicago sky. 43 floors below, the city continued its relentless rhythm. Commuters hurried along sidewalks, their umbrellas blooming like dark flowers against the rain. Traffic lights cycled through their eternal sequence of red, green, and yellow, ordering the chaos of urban life with mechanical precision. But somewhere in that vast urban landscape, a little girl named Mia had somehow reached across the impossible distance between his isolated tower and her unknown world to speak directly to the part of him he thought was safely hidden away. The randomness of it should have been reassuring. Accidents happened. Phones got mixed up. Children said unexpected things. There was no cosmic significance, no deeper meaning to decode. Yet as Daniel stood there, watching the rain trace silver paths down his window, he found himself thinking about hearts, not the metaphorical kind poets wrote about, but the actual organ pumping blood through his chest. When had he last felt it beating with anything other than the steady, reliable rhythm of a man going through the motions of living? When had it last raced with excitement, or skipped with laughter, or even ached with genuine feeling rather than the dull, constant pressure of suppressed grief? The rest of that Tuesday passed in a haze of meetings and conference calls, but Daniel found his attention repeatedly drifting to the memory of that small voice. During lunch with potential investors, he caught himself wondering what the child looked like, where she lived, whether she understood the weight of the words she had spoken. During an afternoon video conference with his West Coast subsidiaries, he found himself studying the faces on his screen, trying to remember the last time anyone had looked at him with anything approaching genuine concern rather than professional deference. By evening, Daniel had convinced himself that the call was simply an odd coincidence, a child playing with a phone, accidentally dialing his number, happening to string together words that momentarily pierced his carefully maintained composure. These things happened. The world was full of random intersections, meaningless coincidences that only seemed significant in retrospect. But as his driver navigated the rain-slicked streets toward Lincoln Park, Daniel found himself looking out at the city with unusually focused attention. In the glow of streetlights and neon signs, he glimpsed fragments of other lives. A woman loading groceries into her car while a small child jumped in puddles beside her. An elderly man walking a small dog despite the weather. Teenagers sharing earbuds and laughing at something on their phone. All of them living, feeling, connecting in ways that felt as foreign to Daniel as speaking in tongues. "You're not alone," the child had said with such certainty. But looking at his reflection in the car window, surrounded by the leather and technology and climate-controlled comfort that money could buy, Daniel felt more isolated than ever. How could anyone, let alone a child he had never met, claim to understand the vast emptiness that had become his constant companion? Yet as his mansion came into view, 23 rooms of architectural perfection, sitting like a monument to solitude behind its iron gates, Daniel found himself carrying those words like a small warm stone in his chest. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ask his security team about the call, track down its origin, satisfy his curiosity, and then put the entire episode behind him like any other minor business anomaly. He never could have imagined that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not only his understanding of wealth and success, but his very definition of what it meant to be truly alive. The investigation took 3 days, though Daniel told himself he was simply satisfying idle curiosity rather than pursuing anything of genuine significance. His head of security, a former Chicago police detective named Marcus Webb, approached the task with characteristic thoroughness, tracing the call through phone company records and building security logs with the same methodical precision he applied to all potential threats to Daniel's privacy and safety. The answer, when it came, was both simpler and more complicated than Daniel had expected. The call had originated from the lobby of his own building, placed using a phone that had been dropped by a delivery worker during the morning rush. Security footage showed a small girl with long chestnut hair picking up the device and, with the fearless curiosity of childhood, pressing the redial button, which happened to connect directly to Daniel's private line. "Her name is Mia Santos," Marcus reported, presenting a thin folder containing the basic information he had gathered. 7 years old, lives with her mother about 6 blocks from here, above a diner on Halsted Street. Mother's name is Maria, works as a waitress. No father in the picture, at least not currently. Clean background, no red flags, just regular working people. Daniel studied the security photograph Marcus had printed. A grainy black and white image showing a small figure in a worn winter coat, her face tilted upward with an expression of innocent determination. Even in the poor quality image, something about her posture, the way she held her head, seemed to radiate the same quiet confidence he had heard in her voice. "That's all?" Daniel asked, though he wasn't sure what else he had expected to find. "That's all," Marcus confirmed. "No hidden agenda, no connection to your business interests, no family history that would explain how she knew to dial your number. Just a kid being a kid, picking up a random phone and saying whatever came into her head." Daniel closed the folder and returned it to Marcus. But the image of that small figure remained vivid in his mind. For the rest of the week, he found himself taking different routes through the city, his driver occasionally detouring past Halsted Street, where Rosario's diner occupied the ground floor of a narrow brick building. The windows were usually steamed with condensation, warm light spilling onto the sidewalk where people hurried past with their heads down against the persistent Chicago wind. He never saw her, though logic suggested that a 7-year-old would be in school during his business hours. Still, his attention was drawn to that neighborhood with magnetic persistence. The contrast between his Lincoln Park mansion and these modest streets felt like traveling between different worlds. One measured in square footage and property values, the other in shared meals and community connections. On Friday evening, as Daniel reviewed financial reports in his home office, he found his thoughts drifting once again to that brief phone conversation. If you want to change the world, start by fixing your heart. What had prompted such words from a child? Did 7-year-olds typically concern themselves with world-changing activities, or had she somehow sensed something in his voice, in the silence that surrounded him, that called forth that particular observation? His reflection was interrupted by the sound of his housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, moving through the rooms below, her footsteps echoing in spaces that were designed for entertaining but had long since fallen silent. Friday nights had once meant wine and conversation with Sarah, lazy discussions about weekend plans, shared laughter over silly television shows. Now they meant solitude so complete it seemed to have weight and substance. Daniel walked to his office window, which faced north toward the cluster of buildings where Mia Santos lived her entirely different life. The distance between their worlds was measured in more than city blocks. It encompassed vast differences in resources, opportunities, daily concerns. Yet somehow in those few minutes on Tuesday morning, those worlds had briefly intersected, creating a moment of connection that refused to fade from his memory. He thought about hearts, about the kind a child might reference without understanding the full implications. His own heart felt like something preserved in amber, perfectly functional but somehow removed from the flow of genuine feeling. It beat steadily, reliably, keeping him alive while remaining carefully insulated from anything that might disturb its rhythm. Perhaps that was what the child had sensed. Not a broken heart, but one that had stopped taking risks, stopped opening to possibilities that couldn't be controlled or predicted. The weekend passed with its customary emptiness. Business calls to international markets where Monday was already beginning. Solitary meals in a dining room designed for 12. Hours spent reading financial publications that felt increasingly divorced from any sense of purpose beyond the accumulation of additional wealth. By Sunday evening, Daniel had to admit that his investigation into the phone call had satisfied his curiosity without diminishing its impact on his thoughts. Monday morning brought a return to routine, the familiar rhythm of market openings, staff meetings, strategic planning sessions that filled his calendar with the illusion of purpose. But as Daniel sat in his office, reviewing reports that documented his empire's continued growth, he found himself staring at his phone with unusual intensity. The device sat silent and unmoving on his desk, a piece of technology designed to connect him with the world yet somehow emphasizing his isolation from it. What would happen, he wondered, if he picked up that phone and dialed information, asked for the number of Rosario's diner? What would he say to a 7-year-old who had somehow reached across the impossible distance between their lives to plant a seed of discomfort in his carefully ordered existence? What did you say to someone who had accidentally reminded you that hearts, like gardens, needed more than protection to truly thrive? The questions hung in the crisp morning air of his office, unanswered but persistent, like the first stirrings of something that might, given enough time and courage, grow into something resembling hope. The decision, when it finally came, surprised Daniel with its spontaneity. On Wednesday morning, after another sleepless night spent wandering the empty rooms of his mansion, he found himself instructing his driver to take a different route to the office, one that happened to pass directly by Rosario's diner during what would likely be the breakfast rush. "Actually," Daniel heard himself saying as they approached Halsted Street, "pull over here for a moment." The diner was exactly as he had imagined it from his brief glimpses during previous detours. A narrow storefront wedged between a laundromat and a shop advertising cell phone repairs, its windows cheerfully fogged with steam from the griddle inside. Hand-painted letters on the glass advertised daily specials in English and Spanish, while a small bell jingled constantly as customers pushed through the door seeking coffee and conversation before facing the day. Daniel sat in the back seat of his town car, watching the theater of morning life unfold before him. Construction workers in paint-spattered coveralls shared tables with office clerks in budget suits, their conversations creating a warm hum of human connection that seemed to radiate outward onto the sidewalk. This was community in its most basic form, people gathering around shared needs for caffeine and sustenance, creating bonds over coffee refills and familiar faces. Then he saw her. Mia Santos emerged from the narrow stairwell beside the diner, her small hand firmly clasped in that of a woman who could only be her mother. Even at a distance, Daniel recognized the cascade of chestnut hair that had been captured in the security photograph, but no grainy image could have prepared him for the child's presence in the full spectrum of morning light. She moved with the unconscious grace of someone completely comfortable in her own skin, pausing to pet a stray cat that had taken shelter under the diner's awning, her face animated with the kind of joy that adults spend fortunes trying to rediscover. Her mother, Maria, according to Marcus's report, appeared tired but attentive, the kind of exhaustion that comes from working multiple jobs while maintaining the energy required to nurture a young child. She wore the uniform of someone heading to work at the diner: black pants, comfortable shoes, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. But when she looked at her daughter, her face transformed with a radiance that made Daniel's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Mommy, look!" Mia exclaimed, loud enough for Daniel to hear through his partially open window. She had discovered something fascinating in the gutter, probably just a piece of colored glass or an unusually shaped piece of litter. But she held it up to the morning light with the reverence of an archaeologist examining a priceless artifact. "Very pretty, mija," Maria replied, crouching down to examine her daughter's treasure with the kind of serious attention that validated the child's excitement. "What do you think it's for?" Mia studied the object thoughtfully, turning it over in her small hands. "Maybe it's a piece of someone's broken dream that's trying to become something beautiful again." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. From the mouth of a 7-year-old came a description of transformation that every self-help book and business seminar had failed to articulate with such poetic precision. He found himself leaning forward in his seat, straining to hear more of this extraordinary child's perspective on the world. Maria smiled and tucked the piece of glass into her apron pocket. "We'll put it on the windowsill with your other special things, okay? Now we need to get you to school before Mrs. Patterson starts wondering where her star student is." They walked toward the bus stop, Mia's backpack bouncing with each step, her conversation a constant stream of observations about the world around them. She pointed out cloud formations, commented on the way the morning light made ordinary buildings look magical, and waved enthusiastically at the elderly man who was setting up his newsstand on the corner. Daniel watched until they disappeared around the corner, then continued to sit in his car for several more minutes, processing what he had witnessed. This was childhood, as he had almost forgotten it could exist. Filled with wonder rather than structured activities, richness measured in small discoveries rather than material accumulation, love expressed through attention rather than expensive gifts. His own childhood, he realized with uncomfortable clarity, had been something quite different. The son of ambitious parents who had built their own modest fortune in Chicago real estate, Daniel had grown up surrounded by comfort, but also by constant pressure to achieve, to excel, to justify the investments made in his education and future. Love had been conditional, tied to grades and accomplishments, expressed through opportunities rather than simple presence. Sarah had been different. She had possessed some of that same quality he had just witnessed in Mia and her mother. The ability to find joy in ordinary moments, to create warmth through attention rather than acquisition. Perhaps that was why her loss had been so devastating. She had been his connection to a way of being in the world that he had never fully learned to access on his own. "Sir?" his driver inquired carefully. "Are we continuing to the office?" Daniel realized he had been sitting motionless for nearly 10 minutes, lost in thoughts that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. "Yes," he replied, settling back into his seat. "Yes, let's continue." But as the town car pulled away from the curb, Daniel found himself thinking about pieces of broken dreams trying to become something beautiful again. Maybe, just maybe, that 7-year-old philosopher had been describing more than just a piece of discarded glass. Maybe she had been offering a metaphor for the possibility of transformation, for the chance that even the most shattered things could be reformed into something worthy of being placed on a windowsill where the light could find them. The idea followed him into his office, where it settled like an unexpected guest who had come to stay. The phone call came on Thursday, 3 days after Daniel's surveillance of the diner. This time, he was expecting it, had been, if he was honest with himself, hoping for it. When his direct line rang at 11:23 a.m., he didn't hesitate before picking up the receiver. "Hello, Mia," he said softly. There was a moment of surprised silence on the other end, followed by a small giggle. "How did you know it was me?" "I've been thinking about what you said," Daniel admitted, feeling oddly like a confession, "about fixing hearts and changing the world." "Oh." Mia's voice grew more serious. "Are you the sad man in the tall building?" The description was so accurate, it took Daniel's breath away. "How did you know I was sad?" "Your voice sounds like my mom's did when she thought I couldn't hear her crying. Like you're trying to be strong, but you're really tired of carrying something heavy all by yourself." Daniel closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the child's intuitive accuracy. In boardrooms full of Harvard MBAs and seasoned executives, no one had ever demonstrated such clear insight into his emotional state. "What's your name?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Mia Santos. I live above the diner where my mom works." "What's your name?" "Daniel. Daniel Hartman." "That's a nice name," Mia said with simple sincerity. "Danny sounds friendlier, though. Can I call you Danny?" No one had called him Danny since childhood. His name had long since solidified into the formal weight of business cards and legal documents. But something about the way this child asked, not presuming, but offering a gift of intimacy, made him smile for the first time in weeks. "Yes," he said quietly. "You can call me Danny." "Good. Danny, do you want to know a secret?" "I would love to know a secret." Mia's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Sometimes when I walk past your building, I can feel that there's someone very lonely up there. My mom says I'm just making things up, but I think some people are so sad it kind of leaks out and you can feel it if you pay attention." Daniel looked out his window at the street below, wondering if it was possible for a 7-year-old to possess such sensitivity, or if he was simply so desperate for connection that he was reading significance into coincidence. "And you decided to call me?" "Not exactly." I found that phone in your lobby, and when I pressed the button it just called you automatically. But then when I heard your voice, I knew you were the sad person I had been feeling. So maybe it wasn't exactly an accident." The logic was circular, the kind of reasoning that only made sense in the magical thinking of childhood. Yet Daniel found it oddly compelling. "What made you think I needed to fix my heart?" "Well," Mia said thoughtfully, "when you love someone and then they go away, sometimes your heart gets scared to love anyone else. It puts up walls to keep from getting hurt again, but then it also keeps out all the good things. My mom explained it to me when I was afraid to make friends after we moved here." The accuracy of this assessment left Daniel momentarily speechless. How could a child articulate what years of grief counseling had failed to address so directly? "You're very wise for 7, he managed. "My mom says I'm an old soul in a young body. She also says I ask too many questions and worry about things that aren't my business, but I think she's mostly teasing." Daniel found himself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time since Sarah's disappearance. The sound felt rusty, unpracticed, but genuine. "Your mom sounds very smart." "She is. She works really hard and sometimes she's tired, but she always has time to talk to me. She says that's the most important job of being a mom, making sure your kids know they matter." The simple statement carried the weight of absolute truth. Daniel thought about his own parents, successful and driven, but always focused on the next goal, the next achievement. When had he last felt that he mattered simply for existing, rather than for what he could accomplish or acquire? "Danny," Mia's voice had grown softer. "Are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here." "Do you have kids?" The question hit like a physical blow. He and Sarah had tried for years, had endured the crushing disappointment of negative pregnancy tests, the invasive procedures of fertility specialists, the gradual erosion of hope that had characterized their final months together. "No," he said quietly. "No children. That's sad. I think you would be a good dad. You have a kind voice, even when it sounds tired." Daniel felt tears threatening, the first he had allowed himself since the early days after Sarah's disappearance. "Thank you, Mia. That means more than you know." "Do you want to meet my mom? She makes the best coffee in Chicago, and she's really good at talking to people who are sad. She helped Mrs. Peterson from upstairs when her husband died, and she always saves extra soup for Mr. Martinez when his disability check is late." The invitation was extended with such earnest generosity that Daniel felt ashamed of his initial suspicion, his assumption that somehow this family might have ulterior motives. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Mia. I'm not very good with people anymore." "That's okay. My mom says the people who think they're not good with people are usually the ones who care the most about doing it right. Besides, you're good with me." The simple faith in her voice was both humbling and terrifying. When had he last allowed himself to be seen, really seen, by another person? When had he last risked genuine connection rather than the safely transactional relationships that characterized his business dealings? "I have to go now," Mia whispered. "I'm supposed to be doing math homework and my mom will be worried if she finds out I called you again, but Danny?" "Yes." "Your heart isn't broken, it's just sleeping. Sometimes sleeping hearts need someone to sing them awake." The line went dead, leaving Daniel alone with words that seemed to echo in the silence of his office. Outside, Chicago continued its relentless rhythm, but something inside Daniel had shifted, like a door that had been locked for years, finally creaking open, just enough to let in a sliver of light. He sat there for a long time, holding the phone and thinking about sleeping hearts and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop protecting himself from the risk of being awakened. Friday evening found Daniel doing something that would have shocked his security team, his board of directors, and probably most of Chicago's financial community. He was sitting alone at a corner table in Rosario's diner, nursing a cup of coffee that had grown cold while he worked up the courage to announce his presence to the woman behind the counter. Maria Santos moved with the efficient grace of someone who had spent years perfecting the choreography of serving others. She flowed between tables, coffee pot in hand, somehow managing to provide not just refills but moments of genuine human connection to each customer. Daniel watched her laugh with the construction workers, check on the elderly gentleman reading his newspaper in the window booth, and gently redirect a toddler who had wandered too far from his mother's table. The diner itself was everything Daniel's mansion was not: warm, lived in, filled with the comfortable chaos of human community. The vinyl booth showed their age in comfortable creases and carefully repaired tiers. The walls were decorated with photographs of regular customers and hand-drawn pictures that could only be Mia's artwork. And the air carried the mingled aromas of coffee, bacon, and something indefinably homey that Daniel couldn't quite identify. He had been sitting there for nearly an hour, ordering pie he didn't eat, and coffee he couldn't finish, trying to find the words to introduce himself without sounding like either a stalker or a potential threat. How did you explain that you were one of Chicago's most powerful billionaires, but that you had been drawn to this modest diner by a 7-year-old's phone calls and her promise that broken dreams could become beautiful again? Maria approached his table with the coffee pot, her professional smile warm but slightly concerned. "More coffee, hun? You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders." The kindness in her voice, so similar to her daughter's intuitive compassion, nearly broke Daniel's carefully maintained composure. "Actually," he said quietly, "I was hoping to talk to you about Mia." Maria's posture shifted immediately, maternal protectiveness replacing casual friendliness. She set down the coffee pot and studied Daniel's face with sharp attention. "Are you someone from her school? Is there a problem?" "No, nothing like that." Daniel realized how his request must sound to a single mother who had probably learned to be wary of unexpected inquiries about her child. "My name is Daniel Hartman. Your daughter. She called me, twice, on my business phone." Recognition dawned slowly in Maria's eyes, followed by something that might have been embarrassment or concern. "Oh, God, I'm so sorry. She mentioned picking up a phone somewhere, but I didn't realize—" "She didn't bother you, did she? I can pay for any charges or—" "Please," Daniel interrupted gently. "You don't understand. She didn't bother me. She helped me." Maria studied his face more carefully, taking in the expensive clothing, the careful grooming, the unmistakable markers of significant wealth. Daniel could see her trying to reconcile his obvious affluence with his presence in her neighborhood diner, with his claim that her daughter had somehow provided assistance to a man who clearly lacked, for nothing, material. "Helped you how?" she asked cautiously. Daniel took a deep breath, realizing that any explanation would sound either magnificent or insane, and possibly both. "She told me that if I wanted to change the world, I needed to start by fixing my heart. She said that I wasn't alone, and that sometimes sleeping hearts need someone to sing them awake." Maria's expression softened as she recognized the particular brand of wisdom her daughter was prone to dispensing. "That sounds like Mia. She's always been unusual that way, very sensitive to other people's feelings." "She is remarkable," Daniel said quietly. "In 2 brief conversations, she showed me more insight than I've received from teams of business consultants and therapists. I came here because I wanted to thank her, and to meet the woman who raised such an extraordinary child." The sincerity in his voice seemed to reach Maria, and she slid into the booth across from him with the cautious grace of someone still not entirely sure of the situation, but willing to give it a chance. "She gets that from her grandmother," Maria said. "My mother always said Mia could see things the rest of us miss. Sometimes it's a gift. Sometimes it's a burden for a little girl." "May I ask? Is her father—" "Not in the picture," Maria said firmly, but without bitterness. "It's just been the 2 of us for the past 3 years. We do fine." Daniel nodded, recognizing the fierce independence of a parent determined to protect her child while maintaining their dignity. "She mentioned that you make the best coffee in Chicago." Despite her wariness, Maria smiled. "She's biased, but it's good coffee, better than that fancy stuff they serve in the downtown towers." I wouldn't know, Daniel admitted. I haven't had coffee anywhere but my office or my house in longer than I care to calculate. Something in his tone caught Maria's attention. She studied his face more carefully, perhaps seeing past the expensive clothes and perfect grooming to the loneliness that Mia had somehow detected from 43 floors up. You work in one of those towers? I own one of them, Daniel said quietly. The Hartman Financial Building on LaSalle. Maria's eyes widened slightly as she processed this information. She was clearly recognizing the name, the weight of wealth it represented, the vast distance between their economic circumstances. But instead of the deference or calculation Daniel usually encountered when people learned of his fortune, he saw something else in her expression: concern. And you're here because my 7-year-old daughter told you to fix your heart? She's not wrong, Daniel said simply. I lost someone very important to me 3 years ago. Since then I've been existing, going through the motions, building my business, managing my investments, but not really living. Your daughter somehow saw that in a brief phone conversation and offered me something I didn't even realize I needed. Maria leaned back in the booth, processing this extraordinary confession. What is it you want from us, Mr. Hartman? The question was asked without hostility, but with the clear expectation of an honest answer. Daniel realized that this was the moment of truth, when he would either find a way to bridge the enormous gap between their worlds or accept that some connections were simply impossible despite their potential beauty. I want to remember what it feels like to be part of something real, he said quietly. Your daughter reminded me that hearts can wake up, but I think I've forgotten how to let that happen. Maybe I could learn. Maria Santos studied the billionaire sitting across from her worn vinyl booth, seeing something in his eyes that her daughter had somehow recognized from miles away. Not a broken man, but a sleeping one, waiting for someone brave enough to sing him back to life. The friendship that developed over the following weeks surprised everyone involved, perhaps none more than Daniel himself. It began with coffee every Friday evening at Rosario's Diner, Daniel arriving after the dinner rush when the crowd thinned and conversation became possible. Maria would finish her shift and slide into the booth across from him, sharing stories about her customers, her dreams for Mia's future, and the small victories that marked their daily life. For Daniel, these Friday evenings became the anchor point of his week. The sterile efficiency of his business meetings and quarterly reviews seemed increasingly hollow compared to Maria's stories about Mrs. Henderson's arthritis, or the young couple who had celebrated their engagement at Table 6, or the regular customer who had finally found a new job after months of unemployment. These were lives measured in relationships and resilience rather than profit margins and market share, and Daniel found himself hungry for every detail. Mia became a frequent part of these conversations, either in person or through her mother's affectionate reports. The child had somehow appointed herself as Daniel's informal life coach, offering philosophical observations through her mother or during their occasional phone calls that left Daniel simultaneously amused and deeply moved by her innocent wisdom. She wants to know if you've started letting sunlight into your house yet, Maria reported one evening, suppressing a smile at her daughter's latest concern. She says houses need sunlight the same way hearts need people, and she's worried that all your windows are still covered up. Daniel realized with some embarrassment that Mia's assessment was entirely accurate. His Lincoln Park mansion remained shrouded in heavy draperies, its rooms artificially lit even during the brightest days. When had he made the decision to shut out natural light, to create a controlled environment that protected him from the unpredictable moods of weather and seasonal change? Tell her she's right, he said quietly. Tell her I'll work on it. The following Monday, Daniel instructed his housekeeper to open all the curtains and remove the heavy drapes that had made his home feel like a mausoleum. The flood of natural light was initially overwhelming, revealing dust motes dancing in sunshine and previously hidden details of the rooms he had shared with Sarah. But instead of the devastating pain he had expected, Daniel felt something closer to relief, as if his home was finally able to breathe again. Other changes followed. small but significant shifts that marked Daniel's gradual emergence from the emotional hibernation that had characterized his life since Sarah's disappearance. He found himself taking lunch breaks, actually leaving his office to walk through Grant Park or along the lakefront. He began accepting social invitations from business associates, discovering that conversations about topics other than quarterly projections were not only possible, but enjoyable. His staff noticed the changes, though they were too professionally discreet to comment directly. His assistant mentioned that he seemed more approachable, more willing to engage in brief personal conversations rather than limiting their interactions to purely business matters. His board of directors observed that while his strategic thinking remained as sharp as ever, he seemed more collaborative, more interested in the human impact of their corporate decisions. The most significant change, however, was Daniel's growing involvement with charitable organizations focused on children and families. It began when Mia mentioned during one of their phone conversations that several children in her school lacked adequate winter coats, their families unable to afford the quality needed for Chicago's harsh weather. "Could you help them, Danny?" she asked with the straightforward confidence that assumed adults could solve problems if they simply chose to do so. "I know you have a lot of money, and they just need to be warm." The request was so simple, so nakedly humanitarian, that Daniel felt ashamed he hadn't thought of such needs himself. Within a week, he had arranged for every child at Mia's elementary school to receive a new winter coat, along with gloves, scarves, and warm boots. But instead of making the donation through lawyers and charitable foundations, Daniel found himself personally visiting the school, meeting teachers and administrators, learning about other needs that money could address. It was during one of these visits that Mrs. Patterson, Mia's teacher, pulled him aside for a private conversation. "I don't know what you've done to inspire such concern from Mia Santos," she said with the fond exasperation of an educator who had learned to appreciate unusual children. "But she talks about you constantly. She's convinced you're some kind of sleeping prince who just needed the right person to help you wake up." Daniel felt simultaneously touched and concerned by this assessment. "I hope she doesn't have unrealistic expectations about—" "Oh, I don't think her expectations are unrealistic at all," Mrs. Patterson interrupted gently. "That child has an uncanny ability to see potential in people and situations that others might overlook. She predicted that Tommy Williams would overcome his reading difficulties when every specialist said it was impossible, and she was right. She somehow knew that Sarah Chen's parents were getting divorced before Sarah knew it herself, and she managed to help Sarah through the transition better than our trained counselors. If Mia says you needed to wake up, then you probably did." The conversation stayed with Daniel through the weekend and into the following week. He found himself thinking about sleeping princes and the power of belief, about the strange alchemy that had transformed a random phone call into what was beginning to feel like genuine purpose. His wealth, for the first time in years, felt like a tool rather than a burden, a means of creating meaningful change rather than simply accumulating additional security. But perhaps the most profound shift was in Daniel's relationship with solitude. The silence that had once felt oppressive now seemed filled with possibility. His mansion, flooded with natural light and gradually being returned to life, felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home waiting to be fully inhabited. He began playing music again, filling the empty rooms with jazz and classical pieces that Sarah had loved. He started cooking simple meals, rediscovering the meditative pleasure of creating something nourishing with his own hands. One evening, while preparing dinner in his kitchen for the first time in years, Daniel realized that he was humming, unconsciously creating music the way people do when they feel genuinely content. The recognition stopped him mid-note, overwhelmed by the simple miracle of finding himself happy in a moment that required nothing more than his own presence. His phone rang just as this realization was settling into place, and Daniel answered it with an openness that would have surprised his former self. "Hi, Danny." Mia's voice bubbled with her characteristic enthusiasm. "Mom says you opened all your curtains and your house is full of sunshine now." "Yes, it is," Daniel confirmed, looking around his light-filled kitchen with something approaching wonder. "Thank you for suggesting it." "You're welcome. But that's not why I called. I have something really important to tell you." Daniel could hear the excitement in her voice, mixed with something that sounded like urgency. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I had a dream about you last night, and in the dream you were dancing. Not by yourself, but with someone who made you really, really happy, and I think maybe that dream is trying to tell us something important." The word sent a chill down Daniel's spine, not of fear, but of recognition. Dancing had been one of the things he had shared most intimately with Sarah, their private celebrations of small victories and quiet Sunday mornings. If this child was somehow channeling messages about love and connection, what did that mean for his carefully rebuilt emotional equilibrium? "What do you think it means?" he asked carefully. "I think it means your heart is almost ready to love again," Mia said, with the certainty of someone announcing the weather. "And that's really, really good news, Danny, because hearts that love make the whole world a little bit warmer." As Daniel stood in his sunlit kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, and eyes filled with tears of gratitude for this extraordinary child who had somehow seen through his defenses to the possibility of joy, he realized that maybe, just maybe, she was right. The crisis came on a Tuesday in November, arriving with the sudden brutality that characterizes most genuine emergencies. Daniel was in his office reviewing investment portfolios when his phone rang with an unfamiliar number that somehow filled him with immediate dread. "Mr. Hartman, this is Dr. Jennifer Reyes at Children's Memorial. We have Maria Santos here, and she asked us to call you. It's about her daughter." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He found himself gripping the edge of his desk, the carefully ordered world of his office suddenly tilting off its axis. "What's wrong? What happened to Mia?" "She collapsed at school this morning. High fever, difficulty breathing, and some concerning neurological symptoms. We're running tests now, but Mrs. Santos is here alone and she mentioned that you're a family friend?" The designation felt both inadequate and precious. "I'll be right there," Daniel said, already reaching for his coat. "Tell Maria I'm coming." The 20-minute drive to Children's Memorial stretched like an eternity. Daniel found himself bargaining with a god he hadn't addressed directly since Sarah's disappearance, offering everything he owned in exchange for Mia's health and safety. The little girl who had called him out of nowhere to wake up his sleeping heart had become far more precious to him than he had dared to acknowledge, and the thought of losing her felt like losing his chance at redemption itself. He found Maria in the pediatric ICU waiting room, still wearing her waitress uniform and looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. Her usual strength had cracked under the weight of maternal terror, and when she saw Daniel approaching, she broke down completely. "They don't know what's wrong," she sobbed against his shoulder as he held her with the awkward tenderness of someone relearning how to comfort another person. She was fine this morning, laughing and making jokes about her math homework, and then the school called and said she just collapsed. Daniel held her while she cried, feeling utterly helpless in a way that no amount of wealth or influence could address. All his resources, all his connections in Chicago's medical and business communities meant nothing in the face of a 7-year-old's mysterious illness. "What do the doctors say?" he asked when Maria had composed herself enough to speak. "They're running every test they can think of, blood work, brain scans, cultures. Dr. Reyes says it could be viral meningitis, or some kind of autoimmune response, or—" Maria's voice broke again. "They don't know, Daniel. My baby is fighting for her life, and they don't know what they're fighting." Over the next 48 hours, Daniel maintained a vigil in the hospital that surprised the medical staff and shocked his own business associates. He canceled meetings worth millions of dollars, ignored urgent calls from board members, and essentially disappeared from his financial empire to sit in uncomfortable plastic chairs and hold Maria's hand while they waited for news that seemed perpetually just out of reach. The tests revealed a rare neurological condition, something that occurred in perhaps 1 in a million children Mia's age. The doctors explained the treatment options with careful professional optimism, but Daniel could read the uncertainty in their eyes. the weight of dealing with a condition so uncommon that protocols were more theoretical than proven. The good news, Dr. Reyes explained during one of their conference meetings, is that children are remarkably resilient and Mia's overall health is excellent. The challenging news is that this type of inflammation can be unpredictable. Some children recover completely, others experience lasting effects, and in rare cases. She didn't finish the sentence, but Daniel heard the unspoken possibility clearly enough. Maria gripped his hand so tightly, her nails left marks on his palm. That night, as Daniel sat alone in Mia's hospital room while Maria finally allowed herself to rest in the family lounge, he found himself talking to the unconscious child whose phone calls had changed his life. "I need you to fight, sweetheart," he whispered, holding her small hand in both of his. "I know you're tired, and I know this is scary, but you have to fight. There are too many people who still need you to teach them about fixing their hearts and finding the beauty in broken dreams." As if responding to his voice, Mia's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing assisted by machines, but something in that small gesture felt like a promise, like the determination of a 7-year-old warrior who had not yet finished her work in the world. Daniel stayed through the night, holding her hand and alternating between prayer and bargaining with whatever forces might have the power to heal a child whose innocence had somehow penetrated the carefully constructed walls around his heart. By morning, his vigil had attracted attention from hospital staff, other families in the ward, and eventually a few reporters who had gotten wind that one of Chicago's most reclusive billionaires was maintaining a bedside watch over a waitress's daughter. The media attention was the last thing Daniel wanted, but it served an unexpected purpose. Within hours, offers of help began pouring in from across the city. Specialists volunteered their services, families shared their own experiences with rare childhood illnesses, and the community that had embraced Mia's warmth rallied to support her fight for recovery. On the third day, as Daniel sat reading aloud from one of Mia's favorite books about angels disguised as ordinary people, her eyes fluttered open. The first word she spoke was his name, barely more than a whisper, but clear enough to bring tears to both his and Maria's eyes. "Danny," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed that morning. "I had the most beautiful dream. I dreamed that all the sleeping hearts in Chicago woke up at the same time, and the whole city started glowing." Daniel brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Maybe it wasn't a dream, sweetheart. Maybe it was a vision of what's possible when people remember how to love." Mia smiled weakly but with unmistakable joy. "I think you're right, Danny. I think sometimes dreams and real life get mixed up on purpose, so we remember to believe in magic. As Daniel looked at this extraordinary child who had somehow survived a medical crisis that had terrified everyone who loved her, he realized that maybe she was right about that too. Maybe the magic wasn't in the recovery itself, but in the way her crisis had revealed the hidden connections between people who had previously lived as strangers. The way shared concern had created community where none had existed before. The little girl who had called him to wake up his sleeping heart had somehow managed to wake up something much larger, a recognition that love, when freely given and gratefully received, had the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. And in that transformation, Daniel glimpsed the possibility of miracles that had nothing to do with medicine, and everything to do with the mysterious alchemy of human connection. Mia's recovery became a gradual but steady journey back to the vibrant child who had first picked up a stranger's phone and offered wisdom beyond her years. The neurological inflammation responded to treatment better than anyone had dared hope, though her doctors cautioned that full recovery would take time and patience. Daniel found himself learning both virtues in ways that his business empire had never taught him. He arranged for the finest specialists to consult on Mia's case, but more importantly, he discovered the healing power of simply being present. He read to her during the long afternoon hours when pain medication made her drowsy but unable to sleep peacefully. He brought art supplies and helped her create elaborate drawings of the angels she insisted were helping her get better. He learned to braid her hair when Maria was working extra shifts to maintain their family income despite the medical crisis. "You know," Mia observed during one of their drawing sessions, carefully coloring the wings of an angel that looked suspiciously like her mother, "I think maybe this whole being sick thing happened for a reason." Daniel paused in his own artistic efforts. He was attempting to draw a cityscape and discovering that his executive planning skills did not translate into visual art. "What kind of reason?" "Well, before I got sick, you were learning to be happy again, but you were still kind of scared to really love people because you thought it might hurt too much. And now you've been taking care of me and Mom, and you're not scared anymore." The assessment was delivered with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone stating an obvious truth, but it hit Daniel with the force of revelation. She was right, of course. Somewhere during those terrifying days when her life had hung in the balance, his carefully maintained emotional barriers had simply dissolved. The risk of loving deeply and potentially losing what you love had transformed from a reason for self-protection into a reason for profound gratitude for whatever time you were given. "How did you get so wise?" Daniel asked, genuinely amazed by this child's insight. Mia shrugged, focusing intently on getting the angel's halo just the right shade of gold. "Mom says I notice things, but I think really I just remember what it feels like to be loved completely, so I can see when other people have forgotten." The conversation stayed with Daniel through the following weeks as Mia grew stronger and their hospital visits became less frequent. He found himself examining his life with new criteria, measuring experiences not by their financial returns or strategic advantages, but by their capacity to generate and sustain genuine love. His business empire, he realized, had become a sophisticated machine for generating wealth without creating meaning. His employees were competent and professional, but how many of them felt genuinely valued beyond their contribution to quarterly profits? His charitable giving had been tax-efficient and publicly recognized, but how much of it had involved actual relationship with the people being helped? The questions led to concrete changes. Daniel began holding monthly lunches with different departments in his company, not to discuss business strategy, but to learn about his employees as human beings. He started visiting the organizations his foundation supported, spending time with the people whose lives were being affected by his donations. He converted one wing of his Lincoln Park mansion into guest spaces and began hosting fundraising events that focused on storytelling and connection rather than simply requesting checks from wealthy donors. But the most significant transformation was in Daniel's relationship with his own capacity for commitment and vulnerability. When Mia was finally discharged from the hospital, he found himself making a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. "I want to set up a college fund for Mia," he told Maria one evening as they sat in Rosario's diner, celebrating her daughter's return to health with chocolate milkshakes and the kind of meal that had become their tradition. Not just tuition, but everything she'll need. Books, living expenses, study abroad programs, graduate school if she wants it. Maria's initial response was the fierce independence he had come to admire and expect. "Daniel, we can't accept that. It's too much, and we've never asked you for anything like that." "I know you haven't asked," Daniel replied gently. "But I'm not offering this because I think you can't provide for Mia. I'm offering it because she has already given me more than I ever imagined possible, and I want to invest in her future the same way you would invest in something precious." Before Maria could protest again, he continued, "Besides, I have a feeling that whatever Mia chooses to do with her life, it's going to make the world better in ways we can't even imagine yet. Consider this a venture capital investment in human potential." The financial terminology made Maria smile despite herself. "You're going to turn my daughter into a business metaphor?" "Your daughter is going to turn the business world into something more human," Daniel replied seriously. "She's already started with me." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching through the diner's windows as evening settled over their neighborhood. The streetlights were beginning to flicker on, creating pools of warm illumination that connected the various small businesses and apartment buildings into a cohesive community. This was home now, Daniel realized, not just the geographic location, but the web of relationships and mutual care that had grown around Mia's initial phone call. "There's something else I want to discuss," Daniel said, his voice carrying a note of nervousness that surprised them both. "I've been thinking about making some changes in how I live, and I wanted to get your opinion on something." Maria raised an eyebrow, recognizing the tone of someone about to make an announcement that felt significant. "What kind of changes?" "I want to sell the mansion," Daniel said quietly. "It's too big, too isolated, too filled with memories that keep me stuck in the past. I want to find something smaller, closer to here, somewhere that feels like it belongs to a community rather than standing apart from one." The confession felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. The Lincoln Park mansion represented not just wealth, but the entire architecture of his old life, the barriers he had built between himself and authentic human connection, the fortress of solitude that had once felt like protection, but now simply felt lonely. Maria studied his face carefully, reading the genuine desire for change alongside the lingering uncertainty of someone preparing to abandon familiar defensive strategies. "Are you sure? That house represents everything you've built? Everything you've achieved?" "No," Daniel corrected gently. "That house represents everything I thought I wanted to achieve. Sitting here with you and Mia, being part of something real and warm and alive, this represents what I actually want my life to feel like." As if summoned by their conversation, Mia appeared from the back room where she had been showing the cook her latest drawings. She slid into the booth beside her mother, her recovery evident in the return of her characteristic energy and irrepressible curiosity. "Are you talking about important things without me?" she demanded with mock indignation. "Just discussing some changes Danny is thinking about making," Maria explained. Mia studied Daniel's face with the intense attention she brought to everything that interested her. "Good changes or scary changes?" "Both," Daniel admitted honestly. "But I think maybe the best changes are always a little bit scary." Mia nodded solemnly, as if this observation confirmed something she had already suspected. "Mom always says that growing feels uncomfortable while it's happening, but then you're glad you did it." She paused thoughtfully. "Are you ready to grow some more, Danny?" The question, asked with such simple directness, seemed to cut through all his remaining hesitation. Looking at this remarkable child who had somehow seen through his defenses to the person he could become, surrounded by the warmth and authenticity of the life they had built together, Daniel felt more ready for growth than he had in years. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think I'm finally ready." The transformation unfolded over the following months with a momentum that surprised everyone, including Daniel himself. The Lincoln Park mansion sold within weeks to a family with 4 children who filled its empty rooms with the kind of joyful chaos Daniel had never imagined the house could contain. He found a modest brownstone, just 8 blocks from Rosario's Diner, a 3-story building that had been converted into condominiums but retained the warmth and character of its original residential purpose. Moving day became a community event, with neighbors from Halsted Street joining the professional movers to help Daniel settle into his new life. Mrs. Henderson from upstairs contributed homemade cookies, Mr. Martinez brought his nephew's truck to help with smaller items, and Mia appointed herself as the supervisor of where each piece of furniture should be placed. "The couch needs to face the window so you can watch people walking by," she declared with the authority of someone who understood the importance of maintaining connection with the outside world. "And the kitchen table has to be big enough for guests because people are going to want to visit you now that you're not hiding in a castle anymore." Daniel found himself laughing at her assessment while simultaneously recognizing its accuracy. The isolation that had once felt necessary for grieving now seemed like an obstacle to the kind of life he wanted to create. His new home was designed for interaction, with an open kitchen that flowed into the living space, windows that remained uncurtained to welcome natural light, and a small garden where he could attempt to grow something beautiful with his own hands. The changes rippled through every aspect of his life. His business meetings became more collaborative. His investment decisions increasingly focused on companies that created social value alongside financial returns. He established a foundation specifically dedicated to supporting children and families in crisis, But instead of managing it from a corporate distance, he spent time visiting programs, meeting recipients, and learning about needs that statistics could never capture. His employees noticed the transformation, though they were initially uncertain how to respond to a CEO who asked about their families and remembered personal details from previous conversations. Gradually, the corporate culture began to shift, as Daniel's genuine interest in people as complete human beings rather than simply professional resources created space for similar authenticity throughout the organization. But perhaps the most significant change was in Daniel's relationship with time itself. The frantic pace that had characterized his business life, the constant pressure to maximize efficiency, to squeeze additional productivity from every moment, gave way to a more organic rhythm that allowed for spontaneity and genuine rest. He discovered the pleasure of Sunday afternoon walks with no particular destination, of calling Mia just to hear about her day, of cooking elaborate meals for friends who had previously known him only in professional contexts. The anniversary of Sarah's disappearance arrived in March, marking 4 years since the morning that had divided Daniel's life into before and after. Previously, this date had been observed with private grief and increased isolation, a day spent reviewing memories and reinforcing the barriers that kept him separate from the possibility of future pain. This year, Daniel found himself approaching the anniversary with a mixture of sadness and gratitude that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. He visited the police station where her case remained officially open, speaking with the detective who still occasionally reviewed the file but had long since exhausted investigative leads. He drove to Navy Pier where her car had been found, standing at the railing and watching Lake Michigan's gray waters while trying to find words for a conversation he had been postponing for years. "I miss you," he said aloud to the wind and waves, feeling simultaneously foolish and relieved to finally voice what had remained unspoken for so long. "I always will. But I think you would want me to be happy, and for the first time since you've been gone, I think I might actually be learning how." That evening, Maria and Mia joined Daniel for a quiet dinner at his new home, the first meal he had cooked for guests in his newly configured life. They lit candles and shared stories about loss and healing, about the mysterious ways that love persists even after the people we love are no longer physically present. "I think Sarah sent me to call you," Mia observed during dessert, her statement delivered with the casual confidence of someone discussing the weather. "Sometimes when people we love go to heaven, they find ways to take care of us even when we can't see them anymore." The suggestion should have seemed like childish fantasy, but Daniel found himself considering it with surprising seriousness. The timing of Mia's first phone call, the wisdom contained in her simple observations, the way her presence had somehow provided exactly what he needed to find his way back to living. It all felt too perfectly orchestrated to be entirely coincidental. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "Maybe love finds a way to continue, even when we think it's been lost forever." Mia nodded solemnly, as if this observation confirmed something she had always known. Love is like energy. Danny. Our science teacher says energy can never really disappear, it just changes form. So maybe love works the same way. As Daniel looked around his dining room, filled with candlelight and conversation, with the warmth of genuine friendship and the promise of continued growth, he realized that maybe this 7-year-old philosopher was right about that too. Maybe love really was like energy, transforming from one form to another, but never truly disappearing, always finding new ways to illuminate the darkness and remind isolated hearts that they were never really alone. The call that would change everything came on a Thursday morning in late spring, nearly a year after Mia's recovery and Daniel's gradual emergence into authentic community. He was in his home office, reviewing proposals from nonprofits seeking foundation support, when his personal phone rang with Maria's number. Her voice was tight with controlled emotion, the tone of someone trying to remain calm while delivering news that threatened to shatter carefully reconstructed equanimity. "Daniel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." The formality in her voice sent warning signals through Daniel's nervous system. Over the months of deepening friendship, Maria had become increasingly relaxed in their interactions, their conversations flowing with the easy warmth of people who had learned to trust each other completely. This sudden distance felt ominous. "Of course," Daniel replied, pushing aside his paperwork and giving her his full attention. "What's wrong?" "I found something yesterday while cleaning out old boxes in our storage locker. A folder of newspaper clippings that my mother saved before she died, articles about missing persons cases in Chicago. There was one about a woman named Sarah Hartman who disappeared 4 years ago, and the article mentioned her husband Daniel." Maria's voice wavered slightly. "I need to know if that's you, Daniel. I need to know if Sarah was your wife." The question hung in the air between them like a live wire, sparking with implications that Daniel couldn't immediately process. His first instinct was to wonder why this information mattered, why Maria's voice carried notes of accusation alongside concern. Then the deeper implications began to unfold. "Yes," he said quietly. "Sarah was my wife." "But Maria, I don't understand why you're asking like this, why you sound upset." There was silence on the other end of the line, the kind of weighted quiet that precedes revelations that will reshape everything that came before. When Maria spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because, Daniel, because the folder also contained a letter addressed to my mother from someone named Sarah, dated just 2 weeks before she disappeared. The letter asking for help finding a way to leave her marriage without causing her husband to have what she called a complete breakdown. The words hit Daniel like physical blows. He found himself sitting down heavily, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. "That's impossible," he managed. "Sarah was happy. We were happy. She never said anything about wanting to leave." "The letter says she felt trapped by your depression and grief over not having children. She said she couldn't carry the weight of your sadness anymore, but she was afraid that leaving would destroy you completely. She was asking my mother for advice about women's shelters, about how to disappear safely when someone's mental health might make them dangerous." Each word felt like another nail being driven into the coffin of Daniel's carefully reconstructed understanding of his marriage, his loss, his entire emotional foundation. The Sarah he had grieved for 4 years, the loving wife who had kissed him goodbye on an ordinary morning and simply vanished, was being replaced by someone who had been planning her escape, someone who had feared him enough to seek help from strangers. "Maria, I would never have hurt her. You know me now, you know I'm not." "Do I?" Maria's voice carried pain that matched his own. "Because the woman who wrote that letter was terrified, Daniel, and she disappeared 2 weeks later. How do I know that your grief isn't really guilt? How do I know that finding us wasn't some kind of attempt to create a replacement family to make yourself feel better about whatever happened to Sarah?" The accusations were devastating not because they were completely unfair, but because they contained fragments of truth that Daniel had never allowed himself to examine consciously. Had he been depressed during those final months with Sarah? Yes, profoundly so, though he had convinced himself that his emotional withdrawal was simply disappointment about their fertility struggles. Had he been difficult to live with? Probably, though he had interpreted Sarah's increasing distance as mutual grief rather than individual desperation. Had his attachment to Maria and Mia been influenced by an unconscious desire to recreate what he had lost? The possibility was too painful to consider directly, too threatening to the foundation of what he had believed about his own healing and growth. "I need time to think," Maria said when Daniel's silence stretched too long. "I need to figure out what this means, what I should do. Can you please not contact us for a while? I need to protect Mia until I understand what we're actually dealing with." The line went dead, leaving Daniel alone with the echo of accusations and the sudden collapse of everything he had rebuilt over the past year. The foundation of his transformation, his relationship with Maria and Mia, his belief in his own capacity for genuine connection, his faith in the possibility of redemption through love, had just been revealed as potentially hollow, built on secrets and half-truths that he had hidden even from himself. Daniel sat in his home office for hours, staring at the phone and trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Outside, the Chicago spring continued its progression toward summer, children playing in the streets that had become familiar, neighbors tending gardens that he had watched grow from winter's barren ground. The community that had embraced him as a redeemed man worthy of love and friendship continued its daily rhythms, unaware that their reformed billionaire was confronting the possibility that his entire transformation had been built on a lie. The letter sat between them like an accusation, its accusations more devastating than any courtroom testimony could have been. Sarah's handwriting, so familiar yet describing feelings Daniel had never suspected, outlined fears and frustrations that painted their marriage in colors entirely different from his memory. But it was the final paragraph that broke something fundamental inside Daniel's carefully reconstructed sense of self. "I know he's not a bad man, Mrs. Santos, but his sadness is eating him alive, and I'm afraid it's starting to eat me too. I need to leave before we both disappear completely, but I don't know how to do it without destroying whatever good is left in either of us." The woman he had grieved as a victim of random tragedy had actually been planning her own escape from what she experienced as a suffocating marriage. The love story he had mourned was, from her perspective, a prison that required breaking free from. The foundation of his grief, and therefore his healing, was not just incomplete, but entirely false. Daniel found himself thinking about Mia's words during their first phone conversation. Sometimes broken dreams need to become something beautiful again. But what happened when the dream was revealed to have been broken from the beginning, when the very foundation of loss and recovery was built on misunderstanding so profound it called into question everything that had followed? As evening fell over his small garden, Daniel realized that the real test of his transformation was just beginning. Everything Maria and Mia had taught him about love, about community, about the possibility of redemption, all of it would now be measured against the most difficult truth he had ever confronted: the possibility that the man he had believed himself to be was as much a fiction as the marriage he had spent years mourning. The darkness that followed Maria's revelation was of a different quality than anything Daniel had experienced, even in the immediate aftermath of Sarah's disappearance. This was not the sharp grief of sudden loss, but the slow-burning devastation of discovering that the foundation of his understanding about love, about himself, about the possibility of redemption, had been built on quicksand. For 3 days, Daniel remained in his brownstone, ignoring calls from his office and abandoning the community connections that had become central to his rebuilt life. He read Sarah's letter repeatedly, searching for alternative interpretations that might soften its implications, but her words remained clear and unforgiving in their assessment of their marriage's final months. "His sadness is eating him alive, and I'm afraid it's starting to eat me too." The sentence haunted Daniel as he wandered through his home, seeing familiar objects transformed by this new knowledge. The photographs he had kept of their happy moments now seemed like evidence of his own self-deception. Had Sarah been smiling for his sake while secretly planning her escape? The meals they had shared, the conversations, the intimate moments he had treasured, were they all tainted by her unexpressed desperation? Worse than the re-examination of his marriage was the contamination of his recovery. Every breakthrough he had celebrated, every moment of connection with Maria and Mia, every instance of renewed hope, now carried the poisonous possibility that his unconscious motivations had been selfish and manipulative. Had he really been learning to love again, or had he simply been recreating the structures of denial that had driven Sarah away? The spiral of self-doubt was interrupted on Saturday morning by an unexpected visitor. Daniel heard the doorbell and ignored it, as he had ignored everything else since Maria's call. But the ringing persisted with a determination that finally forced him to answer. Mia stood on his front step, holding a folded piece of paper and wearing the expression of someone who had made a difficult decision after considerable thought. Behind her, at the garden gate, stood an elderly woman Daniel didn't recognize. Latino, dignified, with the patient posture of someone who had agreed to accompany a determined child on an important mission. "Hi, Danny," Mia said quietly. "This is my abuela Rosa. My mom's mother. We need to talk to you about something important. Daniel's mind struggled to process this information. Mia, I don't think your mother wants you to be here. She asked me not to contact your family. I know, Mia replied with the matter-of-fact tone she brought to most adult complications. But sometimes grown-ups get scared and make decisions that aren't exactly right. And then, kids have to help fix things. The elderly woman approached slowly, her eyes studying Daniel's face with the penetrating attention of someone evaluating character. When she spoke, her English carried the musical accent of someone who had learned the language as an adult but mastered it completely. You are Daniel, she said simply, the man who helped my granddaughter when she was sick, who became family to my daughter and grandchild. Yes, ma'am, Daniel replied, uncertain about the proper protocol for this extraordinary situation. And you are also the husband of Sarah Hartman, the woman who wrote to me asking for help 4 years ago. The confirmation hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Daniel still couldn't fully comprehend. You're the Mrs. Santos she contacted? But Maria said her mother died. I did die, Rosa Santos said with a gentle smile. 3 years ago. Cancer. But before I died, I gave my daughter all my papers, including letters from people who had asked for help over the years. I told her to read them someday when she was older, to understand the kinds of struggles women face, the kinds of courage it takes to ask for help. Mia took Daniel's hand with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted her welcome in his life. Mom found the letter and got scared, Danny. She thought maybe you were dangerous. Maybe you had hurt Sarah and then found us to make yourself feel better about it. The directness of Mia's understanding was both painful and oddly comforting. This child somehow managed to address the horrible possibilities without either minimizing them or allowing them to become overwhelming. But Abuela Rosa says that's not how it happened, Mia continued, looking up at her grandmother with complete trust. She says Sarah left on her own, just like she planned to. Tell him, Abuela. Rosa Santos studied Daniel's face for a long moment, seeming to weigh what she saw there against memories and judgments formed years earlier. Finally, she nodded as if reaching a decision. Your wife came to see me 2 weeks before she disappeared, Rosa said quietly. She was frightened, but not of violence. She was frightened of drowning in sadness, of losing herself in her husband's grief. She said you were a good man who had forgotten how to be happy, and she could no longer remember how to be happy around you. Each word felt like surgery performed without anesthesia, precise incisions that exposed truths Daniel had spent years avoiding. But there was something in Rosa's tone, not accusatory, but not absolving either, that allowed him to continue listening. I helped her find a women's shelter in Minneapolis, gave her the names of people who could help her start over. She wasn't running from danger, she was running toward the possibility of life. But she made me promise something. Rosa reached into her purse and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, but still intact. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, or if her husband ever seemed ready to hear the truth, I would give him this letter. She said he deserved to know that leaving him wasn't about anger, it was about survival. Both his and hers. Daniel's hands shook as he accepted the envelope, Sarah's handwriting on the outside confirming his name with painful familiarity. The implications were staggering. If Sarah had made it to Minneapolis, if she had successfully started over, then she might still be alive. His 4 years of grief might have been spent mourning someone who was simply living a different life under a different name. Is she? Daniel couldn't finish the question. Rosa's expression grew sad. She died 18 months ago. Car accident outside Minneapolis. She had remarried, was apparently happy. The shelter contacted me because she had left my name as someone to notify, asked that I let her first husband know that she had found peace, that she hoped he could find it too. The revelation that Sarah was dead after all, but had lived 2.5 years beyond her disappearance, created a complexities of grief that Daniel had no framework for processing. Relief that she hadn't been murdered was mixed with fresh loss for the life she had lived without him, gratitude that she had found happiness tangled with devastation about the magnitude of their final misunderstanding. "Read the letter, Danny," Mia said softly, her small hand squeezing his. "Abuela Rosa says it explains everything." With trembling fingers, Daniel opened the envelope that had waited 4 years to deliver its message. Sarah's final words to him were written in the careful script of someone taking time to choose each word precisely. "Daniel, if you're reading this, then Rosa kept her promise, and you're finally ready to hear the truth. I left because I loved you too much to watch you disappear into sadness, and because I couldn't save us both by sacrificing myself. We became broken together, but that doesn't mean either of us has to stay broken. I hope you find someone who can love the man you're capable of being, not just the man you were when grief was eating us both alive. You deserve to be happy, Daniel. More than that, you deserve to remember that happiness is possible. Please don't spend your life mourning what we couldn't save. Build something beautiful from what we learned about love, even if we couldn't make it work between us." Daniel read the letter 3 times before the full implication settled into place. Sarah's departure hadn't been abandonment or betrayal. It had been a recognition that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. She had seen what he had been unable to see, that their shared grief was creating a downward spiral that would eventually destroy them both. But more than that, her letter suggested she had believed in his capacity for healing and growth, had written these words with faith that he would eventually find his way to the kind of life that could honor both their shared love and their necessary separation. "She knew," Daniel whispered, looking up at Rosa and Mia with wonder. "Somehow she knew that I could learn to be happy again, even when I couldn't see it myself." "That's what real love does," Rosa replied gently. "It sees potential even when the person can't see it themselves." Mia nodded solemnly, then brightened with the resilience of childhood. "So, now you know that loving us isn't about replacing Sarah. It's about becoming the person she hoped you could be. And that means Mom doesn't have to be scared anymore." The simplicity with which this 7-year-old had cut through the complexity of adult fear and self-doubt left Daniel speechless. Sarah's letter hadn't diminished his connections with Maria and Mia. It had validated them as evidence of exactly the kind of growth and healing she had wished for him. "Will you help me explain this to your mother?" Daniel asked, hope creeping back into his voice for the first time in days. "Of course," Mia replied with the confidence of someone who had never doubted the power of truth to heal misunderstandings. "But first, I think you need to cry about Sarah one more time. The real Sarah this time, not the one you thought you lost, but the one who loved you enough to want you to be happy, even if she couldn't be the one to make you happy." As Daniel looked at this extraordinary child who had somehow understood the emotional architecture of his grief better than any therapist ever had, he realized that maybe the most profound healing happened not when we stopped loving what we had lost, but when we finally understood what that love had been trying to teach us all along. The reunion with Maria came slowly, carefully, with the tentative respect of people who had been reminded that love, however genuine, could still be threatened by misunderstanding and unexamined fear. Rosa Santos had prepared the ground with her own conversation with her daughter, sharing Sarah's letter and the full story of what had transpired 4 years earlier. But emotional understanding required time to catch up with intellectual comprehension. They met at Rosario's diner on a Tuesday evening, the same booth where they had shared their first real conversation months earlier. The setting was familiar, but the atmosphere carried the weight of everything that had been revealed, questioned, and slowly reconstructed over the past week. "I'm sorry," Maria said before Daniel could speak, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent days re-examining fundamental assumptions about people and motivations. "I was so scared when I found that letter, so afraid that I had misjudged everything, that I had put Mia in danger." "You don't need to apologize," Daniel interrupted gently. You were protecting your daughter. That's exactly what you should have done." They sat in silence for a moment, both recognizing that their relationship had crossed a threshold that required new levels of honesty and vulnerability. The easy warmth of their earlier friendship had been complicated by knowledge that made everything both more precious and more fragile. "Can I ask you something?" Maria said finally. "When you first came looking for us, when you started becoming part of our lives, was any part of it motivated by trying to recreate what you lost with Sarah?" The question was fair, and Daniel had spent the past week examining his own motivations with brutal honesty. "Maybe at first," he admitted. "Not consciously, but maybe some part of me was drawn to the idea of a family, of belonging somewhere warm and safe. But Maria, what grew between us, what I feel for you and Mia, it's not about replacing anything. It's about discovering parts of myself that I never knew existed." Maria studied his face, reading the sincerity that had become characteristic of his interactions with her family. "My mother used to say that healing always looks selfish at the beginning, because broken people have to focus on themselves to get strong enough to love others properly. She said the real test isn't whether someone starts healing for selfish reasons, but whether they keep growing once they start feeling better." The wisdom in this observation struck Daniel as characteristic of the Santos family, their ability to see beyond surface motivations to deeper patterns of growth and change. "Do you think I've kept growing?" "I think you've become someone who can hear hard truths without turning them into reasons to stop loving," Maria replied softly. "That's not the same person who was too lost in his own sadness to notice his wife drowning in it too." The assessment was both painful and liberating. Daniel realized that Sarah's letter and Rosa's revelations had provided him with something he hadn't known he needed: evidence that his transformation over the past months had been real, substantial, measurable against his previous capacity for self-awareness and connection. "Where does that leave us?" he asked, genuinely uncertain about how to rebuild what had been shaken by revelations that were simultaneously devastating and clarifying. Maria reached across the table and took his hand, her gesture carrying the weight of decision made after considerable thought. "I think it leaves us exactly where we were before, except now we understand better why we needed to find each other. You needed to learn that love doesn't have to be desperate or consuming to be real. Mia and I needed to see that people really can change, that kindness and generosity aren't always hiding selfish motivations." As if summoned by their conversation, Mia appeared from the back room where she had been doing homework, her approach timing suggesting that she had been waiting for the right moment to rejoin the adults. She slid into the booth beside her mother with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted that this conversation would reach a positive resolution. "Are we done being scared of each other now?" she asked with characteristic directness. "Yes, Mija," Maria replied, pulling her daughter close with one arm while keeping her other hand linked with Daniel's. "We're done being scared." "Good," Mia said with satisfaction, "because I have something important to tell both of you. I've been thinking about what Abuela Rosa said about Sarah wanting Danny to be happy, and I think I figured out what that means." Daniel and Maria exchanged glances, both having learned to pay serious attention when Mia announced that she had figured something out. "Sometimes," Mia continued thoughtfully, "people love each other but they can't make each other happy because they're both too sad at the same time. That's not anybody's fault, it's just what happens. But then later, after they've learned how to be happy again, they can love other people in a way that actually works better." The 7-year-old's explanation of emotional timing and compatibility was so accurate that both adults sat in amazed silence for a moment. So Sarah loved Danny enough to leave so he could learn to be happy, and now he's learned to be happy enough to love us properly, Mia concluded with the matter-of-fact tone of someone solving a mathematical equation. That means everybody gets what they need, just not at the same time or from the same people. Daniel felt tears welling up as he considered the profound wisdom contained in this child's understanding of love as something larger than individual relationships, something that could flow from one connection to another while maintaining its essential integrity. "You're absolutely right," he whispered, overwhelmed by gratitude for the extraordinary family that had somehow chosen to include him in their definition of belonging. "Sarah's love taught me how to love you properly, and your love is teaching me things about happiness that I could never have learned on my own." Mia beamed with the satisfaction of someone whose theory had been validated by adult confirmation. "That's what I thought. Love is like seeds, Danny. You plant them in one garden, and then the flowers make more seeds that you can plant in other gardens, and pretty soon the whole world is more beautiful." As Daniel sat in that familiar booth, surrounded by the warmth of Rosario's diner and holding hands with the woman and child who had somehow become his chosen family, he realized that maybe this was what redemption actually looked like. Not the erasure of past mistakes or losses, but the transformation of even painful experiences into wisdom that could nurture new growth. Sarah's love, even expressed through necessary separation, had planted seeds that were now blooming into something beautiful in an entirely different garden. And maybe that was the most profound miracle of all. Not that love could conquer every obstacle, but that it could transcend even its own limitations to create new possibilities for connection and joy. 1 year later, Daniel stood in the community center that had been converted from an abandoned warehouse on Chicago's South Side, watching as dozens of families celebrated the first graduation ceremony for the Sarah Hartman Foundation's Family Strengthening Program. The initiative, inspired by Mia's insights about love requiring proper timing, and Sarah's understanding about the courage needed to leave destructive situations, provided counseling, job training, and temporary housing for families in crisis. The graduating families represented a spectrum of Chicago's diversity: single mothers who had escaped abusive relationships, fathers learning to rebuild connections with their children, couples who had learned to address addiction and mental health challenges before they destroyed their marriages. What united them was their willingness to do the difficult work of transformation, supported by resources that Daniel's wealth had made possible, but that the community had shaped into something genuinely healing. "Look at Mrs. Rodriguez," Mia whispered, tugging on Daniel's sleeve to direct his attention to a woman in the front row who was weeping as her teenage son received a certificate for completing anger management counseling. "She was so scared when they first came here, but now look how proud she is." Daniel smiled at Mia's assessment, marveling as always at her ability to track the emotional journeys of people around her. At 8 years old, she had become the unofficial mascot of the foundation, her presence at events somehow making even the most skeptical participants more willing to believe in the possibility of positive change. Maria approached from across the room, where she had been coordinating the refreshment table with the efficiency of someone who had learned to manage community events as naturally as she had once managed diner tables. Her role in the foundation had evolved organically, her combination of practical wisdom and innate empathy making her invaluable in working with families who needed someone who understood struggle rather than someone who had studied it academically. "The Johnsons want to talk to you," she told Daniel quietly, referring to a couple whose marriage had been on the verge of dissolution when they entered the program 6 months earlier. "They want to thank you for something specific, but they won't tell me what." Daniel made his way across the room, stopping to congratulate graduates and chat with family members who had become familiar faces over the past year. The Foundation's work had created an extended community that felt simultaneously professional and deeply personal, with boundaries that somehow managed to be both appropriate and meaningless. Robert and Jennifer Johnson approached with the slightly formal manner of people who wanted to express gratitude but weren't sure how to begin. They were both in their 40s, working-class Chicagoans whose marriage had been nearly destroyed by Robert's unemployment, Jennifer's depression, and their mutual inability to communicate about either crisis without triggering escalating arguments. "Mr. Hartman," Robert began, then stopped and shook his head. "Daniel, we wanted to tell you something that we haven't shared with anyone else, not even our counselor." Daniel waited, recognizing the weight of confidence being offered. "Before we came here," Jennifer continued, "I had been planning to leave. I had an apartment picked out, had been saving money secretly, was just waiting for the right moment to tell Robert and the kids. The admission hung in the air, carrying echoes of Sarah's letter and the familiar pattern of marriages collapsing under the weight of unaddressed pain. "But something you said during that first family meeting stuck with me," Robert added. "You said that sometimes people leave not because they don't love each other, but because they're both drowning and don't know how to save each other. You said that the goal wasn't to prevent people from making hard choices, but to make sure those choices came from clarity rather than desperation." Daniel remembered the evening Robert was referencing, one of the monthly meetings where he shared his own story as a way of normalizing the difficult conversations families needed to have about love, loss, and survival. "That night, we went home and talked honestly for the first time in years," Jennifer said. "Not about bills or schedules or who was supposed to do what, but about how scared we both were, and how lonely we felt even though we were living in the same house. We realized we had been planning to give up without ever actually trying to save what we had built together," Robert concluded. "Your story about Sarah helped us understand that leaving isn't the only way to save yourself, but sometimes it's the only way to save someone else. We decided to try saving each other instead." The gratitude in their voices was overwhelming, but what struck Daniel most profoundly was the way his most painful personal experience had been transformed into something that could offer hope rather than just serving as a cautionary tale. Sarah's decision to leave had been born from love and wisdom. Sharing that story had somehow helped another couple find a different but equally loving solution to their crisis. As the evening wound down and families began to disperse back to their neighborhoods throughout the city, Daniel found himself standing outside the community center with Maria and Mia, watching the last graduates say their goodbyes and make plans to stay connected with the support networks they had built over the past months. "Danny," Mia said, her voice carrying the thoughtful tone she used when processing complex observations, "do you think Sarah knows about all of this? About how her love turned into love for all these other families?" The question was asked with the serious curiosity of a child who had been thinking about the connections between individual stories and larger patterns of meaning. Daniel considered his response carefully, wanting to honor both Mia's spiritual intuition and his own complicated relationship with questions about what Sarah might or might not know from whatever plane of existence she now occupied. "I think," he said finally, "that love leaves marks on the world that keep working long after the people who created that love are gone. So maybe Sarah doesn't know exactly what we're doing here, but the love she taught me is still alive and still helping people." Mia nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose theoretical framework had been confirmed. "That's what I thought. Love is like throwing stones in a pond, Danny. The stone goes down to the bottom where you can't see it anymore, but the ripples keep going and going until they touch the whole shore." Maria wrapped her arm around Daniel's waist as they prepared to walk to the car, their gesture carrying the comfortable intimacy of people who had learned to trust their connection despite its unconventional origins and complicated history. "Are you happy?" she asked quietly, the question carrying weight beyond its simple phrasing. Daniel considered the question seriously, looking around at the community center, where dozens of families had just celebrated their commitment to choosing love over desperation, thinking about the foundation that had grown from his personal grief into something that served hundreds of Chicago families, remembering the journey that had begun with a 7-year-old's phone call and led to this moment of standing with two people who had become home in ways he had never imagined possible. "Yes," he said with quiet certainty, "I think I finally am." As they walked through the South Side streets toward their car, past storefronts and apartment buildings where some of the evening's graduates would return to continue the daily work of building healthier families, Daniel reflected on the mysterious alchemy that had transformed his isolation into community, his grief into service, his wealth into a tool for healing rather than a fortress against connection. Mia skipped alongside them, humming a song she had learned in music class, her presence a constant reminder that wisdom often arrived in the smallest packages and that the most profound truths could be delivered with the casual confidence of childhood. The little girl who had once told him that broken dreams could become beautiful again had somehow orchestrated her own prediction, helping to create beauty from the fragments of multiple broken dreams, his own, Sarah's, and those of countless families who had found their way to the foundation, seeking not perfection, but simply the chance to love each other more skillfully. The Chicago skyline glittered in the distance, the Hartman Financial Tower still bearing Daniel's name but no longer defining his identity. Somewhere in those gleaming heights, other lonely people might be sitting in expensive offices, surrounded by the trappings of success, but isolated from the warmth of genuine connection. Daniel found himself hoping that they, too, might somehow receive an unexpected phone call, a moment of grace that would remind them that hearts could wake up, that love could flow from even the most painful losses into new possibilities for joy. As Maria unlocked their car and Mia chattered about plans for the next foundation event, Daniel realized that this was what redemption looked like in real life. Not a dramatic transformation or a single moment of salvation, but the daily choice to use whatever resources, financial, emotional, spiritual, were available to nurture connection and growth, both in himself and in the extended community that had somehow formed around their unlikely family. The sleeping heart that Mia had awakened with her first phone call now beat with steady rhythm, not just sustaining his own life, but pumping love and resources throughout an ever-widening circle of relationships that proved, every single day, that broken dreams really could become something beautiful again. 6 months after the Foundation's first graduation ceremony, Daniel received news that would test everything he had learned about love, loss, and the courage required to embrace an uncertain future. The call came from Dr. Jennifer Reyes at Children's Memorial Hospital, her voice professional but warm with the familiarity of someone who had shared difficult conversations before. "Daniel, I'm calling about Mia's routine follow-up appointment. We found something in her blood work that requires immediate attention. It's not an emergency, but we need to run more comprehensive tests as soon as possible." The words hit Daniel with familiar terror, the same flooding panic he had experienced during Mia's previous illness, but amplified by the knowledge of how much more he had to lose now. Over the past 2 years, this extraordinary child had become far more than the catalyst for his healing. She had become the daughter of his heart in ways that biological adoption papers could never adequately describe. Within hours, Daniel, Maria, and Mia were back in the pediatric ward that had become an unwelcome second home during her earlier crisis. But this time, the atmosphere carried different energy. Instead of the desperate isolation that had marked their previous vigil, they were surrounded by community, members of the Foundation's extended family, neighbors from the Halsted Street corridor, teachers and classmates from Mia's school, all drawn together by love for a child who had somehow touched each of their lives with her particular brand of wisdom and warmth. The tests revealed a recurrence of the neurological inflammation that had nearly claimed Mia's life the year before, but with complications that made treatment significantly more challenging. Dr. Reyes explained the options with careful honesty. Aggressive intervention that might preserve Mia's cognitive abilities, but would require months of hospitalization, or palliative care that would focus on comfort and quality of time rather than pursuing uncertain recovery. "What does Mia want?" Daniel asked, recognizing that this 9-year-old had earned the right to participate in decisions about her own future. The answer came not from Dr. Reyes, but from Mia herself, who had been listening to the medical discussions with the serious attention she brought to everything that mattered. "I want to help you understand something important," and she said to the room full of adults whose faces reflected various combinations of hope, fear, and desperate love. "What's that, sweetheart?" Maria asked, taking her daughter's hand with the gentle attention that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "I think maybe this illness came back because I have more teaching to do, but maybe not the kind where I stay here for a long time," Mia said with the matter-of-fact tone that had always marked her most profound observations. Maybe the teaching is about how love works when someone has to leave and how the people who stay behind can keep growing the love bigger and bigger. The statement hung in the hospital room like a benediction, transforming the medical crisis into something that felt simultaneously devastating and sacred. This child who had spent her short life helping adults understand emotional truths they couldn't grasp on their own was somehow preparing them for the possibility that her greatest lesson might be about the courage required to love fully even in the face of certain loss. Over the following weeks, as Mia underwent treatments that were simultaneously hopeful and palliative, she approached her illness with the same combination of practical wisdom and spiritual insight that had characterized her entire relationship with the adult world. She continued to offer guidance to families in the Foundation's programs, participating in counseling sessions from her hospital bed via video calls that somehow carried more emotional weight than traditional in-person meetings. "Mrs. Williams," she said to a woman whose marriage was struggling with infidelity issues, "sometimes when people hurt each other, it's because they forgot that love is supposed to make you feel bigger, not smaller. Maybe you and Mr. Williams could try remembering what it felt like when you made each other feel like you could do anything." The advice, delivered with the authority of someone who had never experienced romantic betrayal but somehow understood its emotional architecture, helped the Williams family navigate their crisis more effectively than months of traditional counseling had accomplished. Daniel found himself learning new lessons about the nature of love during those hospital days, watching Mia transform her illness into an opportunity for service rather than retreating into self-pity or fear. Her room became a gathering place for the various communities she had touched, with rotating visitors who came seeking comfort and left having provided it instead. "Danny," she said, during one of their quiet evening conversations, "are you scared about me maybe dying?" The question was asked with characteristic directness, cutting through the protective euphemisms adults use to avoid confronting difficult realities. "Yes," Daniel admitted, recognizing that this extraordinary child deserved honesty rather than false comfort. "I'm terrified. You changed my life. Mia, you saved me in ways I'm still discovering. But that means you'll be okay," Mia replied with satisfaction. "That means you learned how to love properly, so even if I can't stay here with you, the love will keep working. It will help other people the way mine helped you." The conversation continued through the evening, with Mia somehow managing to prepare Daniel for loss while simultaneously deepening his understanding of what she had been teaching him from their very first phone call. Love, she explained, with the patience of someone instructing a slow but well-meaning student, was not about possession or permanence. It was about transformation, about using whatever time you were given to help the people around you become more capable of joy and connection. "Remember when you thought Sarah leaving meant you couldn't love anyone else?" Mia asked. "But then you learned that her love taught you how to love us better?" "That's how all love works, Danny. It builds on itself, like steps going up and up until you can see farther than you ever imagined." As autumn progressed into early winter, Mia's condition stabilized enough for her to spend time at home between treatments, creating opportunities for final conversations and shared experiences that carried the weight of completion. The Foundation organized a special celebration in her honor, recognizing not just her role in its creation, but her ongoing influence on every family it served. The event was held at the same Southside Community Center, where they had celebrated the first graduation ceremony, but this time the focus was on gratitude rather than achievement. Families who had completed the program returned to share stories about how Mia's wisdom had influenced their healing, while current participants presented her with artwork and letters expressing the impact of her guidance on their journeys. "You taught us that love is like seeds," said one of the fathers, reading from a letter signed by his entire family. "We planted the seeds you gave us, and now our whole family is growing into something beautiful." "Hussy." Mia listened to these tributes with the serene attention of someone who had lived her brief life with intentional purpose and could recognize the fruit of her labor being acknowledged. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Daniel stood to address the crowded room, his voice steady despite the tears that had become his constant companion. 2.5 years ago, this remarkable child called my office by accident and told me that if I wanted to change the world, I needed to start by fixing my heart, he began. I thought she was just a little girl saying something sweet. I had no idea that she was actually a teacher who would spend the next years of her life showing me and hundreds of other people what love looks like when it's practiced with courage and wisdom. Daniel paused, looking at Mia, who was seated in the front row between her mother and grandmother, her face glowing with the particular radiance that serious illness sometimes created in people who had made peace with uncertainty. Mia taught me that broken dreams can become beautiful again, but not by being fixed or returned to their original form. They become beautiful by being transformed into something entirely new, something that serves larger purposes than we ever imagined when we first dreamed them. The speech continued for several more minutes, but